I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Where my grandfather's cabin used to stand, there was nothing but a pile of broken wood and shattered dreams. 60 years of family memories reduced to splinters and dust. My hands were shaking as I got out of my car. This had to be some kind of mistake. The cabin was supposed to be here when I got back from my business trip. Instead, I was staring at what looked like a tornado had hit the place. Well, look who finally decided to show up. I turned around to see Karen Walsh standing there with the biggest smile I'd ever seen on her face. She was wearing one of those expensive blazers that screamed, "I'm in charge," and holding a thick folder like it was some kind of weapon. "Karen, what the hell happened to my cabin?" I asked, my voice cracking. She crossed her arms and tilted her head like she was talking to a stupid child. "Your little shack was violating 23 different HOA rules, Mike. As president of this community, I had to take action to protect everyone's property values." 23 violations? This cabin had been here since 1962, built by my grandfather with his own hands after he got back from Vietnam. It wasn't hurting anybody. It was where I learned to fish, where my dad taught me how to fix cars, where 3 generations of my family had spent the best days of our lives. "You can't just tear down someone's property," I shouted. "There are laws." Karen laughed like she just heard the funniest joke in the world. "Oh honey, I followed every single law. I sent you certified letters, left voicemails, even had my assistant try to reach you. Not my fault you decided to ignore all of them while you were playing businessman in Chicago." That hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd been working in Chicago for 4 months, but I checked my mail every single day. I forwarded everything important to my hotel. There was no way I would have missed letters about my family's cabin being demolished. "I never got any letters," I said. "That's what they all say," Karen replied, waving her folder around. "Denial won't bring your little clubhouse back, sweetie." I wanted to grab that folder and throw it in the nearest trash can, but I knew that wouldn't help anything. My brain was still trying to process the fact that 4 generations of family history had been turned into firewood while I was sitting in boring meetings about quarterly sales reports. As Karen walked away, probably to go ruin someone else's day, I started taking pictures of the destruction with my phone. Something about her story didn't make sense, and I'd watched enough detective shows to know you always document everything. That's when I saw Mrs. Henderson from across the street waving at me from her front yard. She'd lived in this neighborhood longer than anyone, and if there was something fishy about Karen's demolition party, she'd know about it. "Terrible thing what happened here," she said as I walked over. "You saw the whole thing?" "Saw it, heard it, and tried to stop it," she said, shaking her head sadly. "Told those construction workers they were making a big mistake, but that Karen woman said she had all the legal papers and threatened to have me arrested if I didn't mind my own business." Mrs. Henderson invited me into her kitchen and made me a cup of coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. As we sat at her table looking out at the pile of rubble that used to be my safe place, she started telling me things about Karen that made my blood boil. This wasn't Karen's first demolition rodeo. Since becoming HOA president 3 years ago, she'd managed to get 6 other problem properties either torn down or heavily modified. Each time, the owners had been either elderly, out of town, or too poor to fight back with lawyers. "That woman has a system," Mrs. Henderson explained. "She picks on people who can't defend themselves, claims their property is hurting everyone else's home values, and then brings in her demolition crew faster than you can blink." "But there have to be legal protections," I said. "Of course there are, but most people don't know about them until it's too late. Karen counts on folks being too scared or too broke to hire attorneys." As she talked, I started getting angrier and angrier. Karen hadn't just demolished my cabin by accident, she'd specifically chosen to do it while I was out of town, when I couldn't stop her or defend my property. "There's something else you need to know," Mrs. Henderson said, lowering her voice. "About 10 years ago, some government people came around asking questions about your grandfather's cabin. They took lots of pictures and interviewed several of us about what we remembered from the old days." My heart started racing. "What kind of questions?" "About your grandfather, about the cabin, about some of the important meetings that used to happen there. Your granddad was involved in some pretty significant civil rights work back in the 60s, you know. That cabin wasn't just a family vacation spot, it was where a lot of the local integration planning took place." I almost choked on my coffee. My grandfather had mentioned being involved in community work during the civil rights era, but he'd always been humble about it. I had no idea the cabin itself might have been historically important. "Do you think the government might have records of this?" I asked. "Wouldn't surprise me one bit. Government folks love their paperwork more than anything." I thanked Mrs. Henderson and drove home with my mind racing like crazy. If the cabin had historical importance that Karen didn't know about, she might have just made the worst mistake of her entire life. That night, I went down to my grandfather's basement and started going through his old papers. He'd saved everything, every receipt, every letter, every document in neat folders organized by year. 4 hours later, buried behind a box of old tax returns, I found something that made me actually shout out loud with excitement. It was an official certificate from the State Historical Preservation Department, dated 1998, declaring my grandfather's cabin a protected historical landmark. The document was thick, official-looking, and covered in more government stamps than a passport. According to the paperwork, the cabin was protected by state law from being demolished, changed, or removed without written permission from the State Preservation Board. Anyone who destroyed a protected landmark without proper authorization could face criminal charges, huge fines, and be forced to pay for complete rebuilding. I sat there in that basement holding this piece of paper and started laughing like a crazy person. Not because I was happy my cabin was still gone, but because I realized that Karen Walsh had just committed a serious crime and had absolutely no idea what she'd done. Karen hadn't just broken some HOA rules or violated property rights. She'd committed a felony against the state government, and she was about to find out what that meant. My first phone call was to a lawyer. My second call was to the State Historical Preservation Department. My third call was to Karen Walsh herself. "Karen speaking," she answered, sounding like she was having the best day of her life. "Karen, this is Mike. I found something in my grandfather's papers that you're going to want to know about." "Oh, let me guess, more fake documents to try to get out of paying the cleanup fees?" she said with that nasty laugh of hers. "My lawyer warned me you'd probably try something like this. Your lawyer might want to research state preservation laws before he gets too confident," I said. "Especially the criminal penalties for destroying protected historical landmarks." Silence. Dead silence. The kind of silence that happens when someone's brain is trying to process information that could destroy their entire life. "I don't know what you think you found, but I found the official state certificate declaring my grandfather's cabin a protected historical landmark," I interrupted. "The same cabin you demolished 2 days ago. The same cabin that's now protected by state criminal law with felony penalties." More silence. Even longer this time. "That's impossible," she finally stammered. "I would have known about something like that. The county would have told me." "You're making this up." "Karen, I'm emailing you a copy of the preservation certificate right now. You might want to call your lawyer and ask him about prison sentences for destroying protected historical properties." I hung up before she could say anything else and immediately sent copies of the historical documents to my lawyer, the State Preservation Office, and Karen's email address. 2 hours later, my phone rang. The woman calling introduced herself as Jennifer Martinez from the State Historical Preservation Department, and she sounded both excited and angry at the same time. "Mr. Johnson, we've been hoping for a case like this for years," she said. "Usually when protected properties are threatened, we can step in before any damage happens. But when someone actually destroys a protected landmark, well, the legal system takes that very seriously." "What kind of trouble is Karen looking at?" "Class B felony, up to 7 years in prison, fines up to $100,000, and complete financial responsibility for restoration costs. Plus civil damages for the historical value of what was destroyed." I felt a warm feeling in my chest that had nothing to do with Mrs. Henderson's strong coffee. How fast can this move forward? "We're opening a criminal investigation immediately. I'll have investigators at the site first thing tomorrow morning, and we'll be filing formal charges by the end of the week." That night, I slept like a baby for the first time in months. Tomorrow was going to be a very educational day for Karen Walsh. The next morning was better than Christmas. I was drinking coffee on my front porch when 4 official government cars pulled up to where my cabin used to be. People in suits and hard hats got out and started photographing everything, measuring the destruction, and treating the pile of rubble like it was evidence in a murder case. Which, in a way, it was the murder of a historically significant building. Around 9 a.m., Karen came charging out of her house in a bathrobe and slippers, looking like she'd been woken up by a fire alarm. She marched over to the investigators and started yelling about what they were doing on her community's property. I couldn't hear every word from my porch, but I caught enough to understand that Karen was getting her first real lesson in federal preservation law. The conversation involved a lot of angry gesturing from Karen and a lot of calm, professional responses from the investigators that seemed to make her more and more upset. One of the investigators, a tall woman with glasses, pulled out what looked like a thick legal document and started reading from it. Karen's face went from red to white to green as she listened. By 11 a.m., the investigators had finished their work and packed up their equipment. By 11:15, Karen was pounding on my front door like she was trying to break it down. "You bastard," she said when I opened the door. "You planned this whole thing." "I planned it?" I laughed. "Karen, you demolished my family's cabin without checking if it was legally protected. That's not planning, that's just being stupid." "There's no way you didn't know about that historical thing," she said, her voice getting higher and more desperate. "You hid it from me on purpose. I found out about it the exact same day you did, yesterday afternoon, when I was going through my grandfather's old papers trying to figure out what to do after you destroyed my property." She stood there opening and closing her mouth like a fish gasping for air. "My lawyer says you can't prove I knew about the historical status beforehand," she finally said. "Your lawyer is probably right," I agreed. "But here's the thing about felony charges, they don't care if you knew or not. When you destroy protected property without checking its legal status first, ignorance isn't a defense." Karen's face went through about 6 different colors before settling on a sickly yellow that reminded me of old mustard. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. "I want my family's cabin rebuilt exactly the way it was, using proper historical standards," I said. "I want a public apology to the entire community for abusing your power. And I want you to resign from the HOA immediately. And if I refuse? Then you can explain to a judge and jury why you thought it was okay to demolish protected historical landmarks without following state and federal law." She left without saying another word, but I could see her hands shaking as she walked away. 5 days later, Karen Walsh was arrested at her home on charges of destroying protected historical property, abuse of authority, and fraud. The local newspaper ran the story on the front page with a headline that read, "HOA President Arrested for Demolishing Civil Rights Landmark." The article explained that my grandfather's cabin had been an important meeting place during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, where local activists had planned integration efforts and voter registration drives. Karen had demolished it without getting required state permits or doing any historical research. The story exploded on social media. Within hours, Karen Walsh became the most hated person on the internet. People shared the article thousands of times, and her mugshot became a symbol for everything wrong with power-hungry HOA presidents. Comments poured in from people all over the country sharing their own horror stories about abusive homeowner associations. Someone made a meme using Karen's arrest photo with the caption, "When you demolish a civil rights landmark to improve property values." It got shared over 1 million times. But the real satisfaction came 8 months later, when Karen was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay $150,000 in fines. She also had to fund the complete restoration of my grandfather's cabin using historically accurate materials and construction methods. The restoration cost Karen nearly $300,000. She had to sell her house, her car, and most of her belongings to pay for it. Last I heard, she'd moved to another state where hopefully no one would recognize her from all the news coverage. The rebuilt cabin is absolutely beautiful, actually better than the original in many ways, but it still has all the character and history that made it special to my family. There's now a bronze plaque by the front door explaining its important role in the local civil rights movement, and it's officially listed on the National Register of Historic Places. I spend most weekends there now, sitting on the same front porch where my grandfather used to tell me stories about the old days and the importance of standing up for what's right. Sometimes I think about Karen Walsh and wonder if she learned anything from the experience. But mostly I just enjoy the peace and quiet, and the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that sometimes, when you stand up to bullies who think they can push people around, justice actually wins. The funniest part? Property values in our neighborhood actually went up after the story came out. Turns out people love living near historically significant landmarks, especially ones with inspiring stories about fighting corrupt authority figures. My grandfather would have laughed his head off at that irony. Karen demolished his cabin to raise property values, and ended up raising them even higher by getting herself arrested for it. Every time I see a news story about some other HOA president abusing their power, I smile and think about Karen Walsh trying to explain to her cellmate why she's in prison for tearing down a cabin. Some lessons cost more than others, but they definitely stick better that way. And the best part of all? The cabin is protected forever now. No future Karen Walsh will ever be able to touch it again because now everyone knows exactly how important it really is. Justice served, family legacy restored, and one less tyrant making people's lives miserable. I call that a pretty good ending to a really bad situation.